and welcome to today's lecture on the founding of Rome. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to hear the story about the founding of the Eternal City. Now, the people who get credit for it, of course, are Romulus, and to a lesser extent his brother Remus. But as we'll see, women played a crucial role in Rome's early success. So whether you want to found a city or are looking to start an empire, journey with me as we investigate the founding of Rome.
The founding of Rome stands at the intersection of myth and history. Roman historians certainly wrote about Rome's earliest days, but this was often centuries after the events themselves. Archaeological evidence, on the other hand, removes some of these biases. But while it's useful for telling us when Rome may have been founded, and indicating information like the types of houses of the earliest inhabitants and the size of the settlement, the personalized nature of the historical accounts is completely absent from the archaeological remains.
So when Roman historians write about the founding of Rome, even though they're calling it history, it's just as much mythology as it is history. And maybe some of the people that they name, maybe they actually lived. And maybe some of them even did the great deeds that we associate them with. There's really no way of knowing. And even the ancient Roman historians themselves knew that they were talking just as much about the present as they were about the past.
Our most complete version of the foundation of Rome comes from the Roman author Titus Livius, who we usually call Livy. And Livy was writing at the end of the 1st century BCE, and this just so happens to be the exact time that the first emperor, Augustus, was ruling a newly pacified Rome. And so when we read Livy's story about Romulus and about the foundation of the city, there are abundant parallels between what makes Romulus a good leader and those same qualities in Augustus, the current leader in Rome at the time.
So this would be like you or me writing a history of medieval England, when the oldest source we have doesn't go back 700 years, it goes back maybe to like the time of our founding fathers. And it's interesting to kind of think of ancient history as mythology, but it very much is centered on stories.
The founding of Rome is inextricably bound with the story of Romulus and Remus. But the story itself begins with previous generations. Aeneas was Romulus's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And Numitor, Romulus's grandfather, is the one who begins our tale. Numitor was the king of Alba Longa, but his younger brother, Amulius, was always jealous and eventually overthrew the rightful king. To avoid retribution, he made the daughter of Numitor, a woman by the name of Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin to prevent her from having any male heirs.
Now the punishment for a Vestal virgin breaking her vow of chastity is to be buried alive upside down. But what Rhea Silvia says is that it was the god Mars who came to her in her sleep and impregnated her. And I guess you better have a good story like that if you want to avoid such a terrible punishment.
To save the twins from the evil usurper Amulius, she puts them in a basket and floats them down the river, just like tiny baby Moses in the Bible. And eventually they wash up in the reeds in a bend in the river, and there a she-wolf, a lupa in Latin, pulls them from the water and suckles them at her teat. And this wolf becomes the symbol of Rome for millennia to follow. Soon they're discovered by a farmer who takes them in and raises them. And once grown, they go back to Alba Longa, defeat Amulius, and reinstall their grandfather Numitor as the rightful king.
And so they leave Alba Longa, and they go back to that spot on the Tiber River where their basket washed ashore and they were suckled by the she-wolf. And they decide they're going to found a city there. But now they start to disagree, and Romulus wants to found it on the Palatine Hill. Remus wants to found it on the Aventine. And instead of agreeing, they just start founding two separate cities. And the first thing you do is you mark out the sacred boundary around the city. So they do that around their hills. And then they start building walls. And one day, Remus comes over to the Palatine Hill, jumps over Romulus's wall, and Romulus kills his brother. And he says that this is going to happen to anyone who crosses the walls of Rome. And hence why we call it, Rome and not Rheims.
Now we have the city of Rome, but no people to live in it. So Romulus calls for all the outcasts of the neighboring towns. And thus Rome becomes a town of all men, and not particularly upstanding ones at that. And while the population was growing, it would only last for a single generation. So Romulus sends out the call to Alba Longa, and Fidenae, and all the neighboring towns asking for women to help with the burgeoning city of Rome. But rather understandably, none of those towns want to give up their women to a bunch of outcasts in a new city. Rome's chances for survival look grim.
And so Romulus decides to throw a giant party. And he invites everybody, but especially the Sabine tribe. And the Sabines show up, and there's music, and there's lots of wine, and people are getting kind of drunk, and there's dancing. And then at that allotted moment, they blow the horn. And this is the signal for the Roman men to seize the women and to kick the men out of the city. And we know this episode is the rape of the Sabines. And it's not because they're having their way with them there, but it's because it comes from the Latin word rapio, meaning to seize. It's the seizure of the Sabines.
Now the Sabines are understandably upset, and they plot to get their women back. Eventually, the Roman traitor Tarpeia shows them a way into the city. She was later thrown from a rock, which still bears her name. And once inside, battle ensued. Roman swords clashed with Sabine shields, until eventually the Sabine women came running out into the middle of the fray. They yelled at the Sabines, "You guys are our fathers and our brothers." And they yelled at the Romans, "You guys are our new husbands." Please stop fighting amongst yourselves. If you want to go ahead and kill anyone, kill us instead.
And so this brought peace between the two groups. And they came to an agreement as well, that the first leader, Romulus, would be a Roman, but after Romulus passed on, the second leader would be a Sabine. And it's really interesting here as well to look at the role of women, right? On the one hand, they're kind of inflicted upon. They don't have a lot of agency. And on the other hand, they're absolutely crucial to the success of the early city.
And so Romulus became the first king of Rome. Now a Rome with men and women, and a new people to share it with. Romulus's rule was one of conquest, and for the next 40 years, Livy says he expanded Roman power by conquering nearby tribes and towns. Frequently, upon defeating a neighboring people, he would disband that city and move the entire population to Rome.
So it's important to keep in mind the speed and scale of expansion here. Rome's founded in the 8th century BC, right at the same time that Greece is coming out of the Dark Ages. But while Rome grows very, very slowly over the course of a couple centuries, Greece ends up expanding very quickly. And within the 8th century, they're already founding cities far and wide across the Mediterranean, in southern Italy and Sicily, southern France, and eastern Spain.
Towards the end of his 40-year rule, Romulus brought together the leading men of the city in order to make a proper religious sacrifice. And as the sacrifices were being prepared, a storm struck. Thunder and lightning poured out from the heavens, and the senators all ran for cover. And finally, as the storm cleared, they started looking for Romulus, but he was nowhere to be found. Rumors spread that it turned out that he'd been taken up in a magical chariot into the heavens. We now call this the apotheosis of Romulus.
And so Rome's population grew and grew and grew. And it's interesting to reflect on the veracity of Livy's story. Is it likely that Rome conquered some of its neighboring peoples? Absolutely. But did it happen exactly the way that Livy describes? We really have no way of knowing.
So if Livy was writing more than 700 years after the mythical founding of the city of Rome, how in the world do we know what actually happened with the birth of the city? Well, in some sense, we just have no way of knowing whether Romulus actually existed, or whether Numitor was ever deposed, or whether the Sabines were ever seized. These ultra-specific names and events are beyond the scope of our evidence. On the other hand, archaeological evidence, from skeletons and burials, to pottery sherds, to housing remains, they can tell us quite a bit about Rome in its earliest days.
For one, we can see that Rome really was the city of 7 hills. And the earliest kind of remains in the city are burials on top of these hills. And it turns out that those burials look an awful lot like the burials of the Etruscan culture. And the Etruscans kind of centered to the north of Rome. They're the most dominant cultural group in Italy at the time of Rome's foundation and early rise.
The earliest houses are of particular interest. No physical structures remain standing, of course, but we do have small incisions into the bedrock. And into these holes, posts would have been planted to hold up the roof and walls of the structure. And it just so happens that the earliest of the housing remains are on the Palatine Hill, the hill Romulus was said to have founded his city upon. And not only that, they also date to around the 8th century BCE, rather close to the 753 BCE legendary founding date of the city. We can tell from these small house-shaped urns used by the Etruscans that the form of the early Roman houses matches those of the Etruscans quite closely.
So does this confirm Livy's story about the foundation of Rome? Well, we really have no idea whether it was founded in exactly 753 BCE by a guy named Romulus. But it's pretty interesting that the archaeological record generally backs up the kind of general timeline that accords with Livy's story. So we see that mythology isn't just about gods and heroes. It can be intimately tied to the history of ancient empires. And with Romulus and Remus, we can see that their kind of power and influence in the story reflects upon the power of the current emperor in Rome as well. And it's interesting that the archaeological remains kind of generally confirm the broad outline of the story told in Livy. Just a few interesting takeaways you can learn from
the founding of Rome.